Genesis chapter 21 verses 22 to 34. At that time Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. Now swear to me here before God that you will not deal falsely with me or my children or my descendants. Show to me and the country where you now reside as a foreigner the same kindness that I have shown to you. Abraham said, I swear it. Then Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. But Abimelech said, I don't know who has done this. You did not tell me, and I heard about it only today. So Abraham bought sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a treaty. Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs from the flock, and Abimelech asked Abraham, What is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart by themselves? He replied, Accept these 7 lambs from my hand as a witness that I dug this well. So that place was called Beersheba, because the 2 men swore and made an oath there. After the treaty had been made at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the eternal God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines for a long time.
The story of Abraham so far, as we've been following it through, has mentioned Abimelech before. You'll remember the story of Abraham and Abimelech and how it was that Abraham had said to Sarah, Say that you are my sister, and Abimelech had then taken Sarah with the intention of putting her as one of his wives. We've been through that story. Since then, we've had the birth of Isaac, and we've had the casting out of Ishmael. And now we're back to the story of Abimelech. We seem to be in a rather peaceful time for Abraham. And Abimelech comes to Abraham, and he says of him, At that time Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. God is with you in everything you do. There is a testimony for you. Here is somebody who isn't a follower of the same God as Abraham, probably has his own household gods, yet he looks on to see what's happening in Abraham's life, and he says, God is with you in everything you do. It's something that kind of shone out from Abraham and was obvious to those people around him. And I thought as I read this, wouldn't this be, the testimony that we would want people to say about us? We would want people who actually knew us, whether they were followers of Jesus or not, to say the same kind of thing about us. To say that it is obvious that God is with us. God is with you in everything you do. I wonder what it was that made Abimelech think that. What was it about the life of Abraham that Abimelech saw which said, God is with this man? It could simply have been the idea that if somebody prospers, that shows that he's being blessed. So it could be simply that Abimelech looks on to Abraham, this nomad, with his flock and his herds and his servants and his slaves and his large family. Remember, when it was necessary, he raised over 300 troops from his own household to go and fight. Maybe Abimelech just looked on and said, look how blessed this person is. That's the fact that God is with him. Could have been. It may have been the way that Abraham acted. It could have been that Abraham was seen as being an honest man, a trustworthy man. There are problems with that particular explanation when you actually think back to the earlier story where Abraham had said to Sarah, tell him you're my sister, and Abimelech had got into quite a lot of trouble because of that. There's all sorts of reasons why it may have been, but I would like to think that that's how people would see us, as people who it is obvious God is with. And that would reflect, I think, from our dealings with the world, the fact that we do things differently, that we are seen to be honest and trustworthy, and that people would look at that and say, God is with that person. Sometimes when we actually make decisions for the right reasons, we make the decisions because this is the right thing to do, but it doesn't necessarily benefit us as we would like things to benefit us. It doesn't necessarily work to our advantage. We make the decision because it is the right decision to make. People see within that the fact that God is with us, that we have made the decision because it is right, rather than because it was expedient, rather than because we were going to benefit from it. We made the decision because it was the right decision. I just look at that verse and think, that's how I would like people to see me. That's how I would like people to see all of us who follow Jesus. That they would say of us, God is with you in everything you do. Because Abimelech believes that, he then says to Abraham, now swear to me here before God that you will not deal falsely with me or my children or my descendants. Show to me and the country where you are living as an alien the same kindness that I have shown to you. Why does he ask Abraham to swear this? He asks him to swear it because he knows that Abraham is a follower of God, and that if he makes this promise, Abraham will keep the promise. That's what's happening. He's asking him to swear an oath because he believes him to be an honest man, and that his oath can be relied upon, that there would be no false dealings between them. Abraham, it appears, makes this promise and goes about his business. He goes about his business, and one of the things that he does is to dig a well. Wells are important in that part of the world, especially for nomadic tribes. It's important that you know where the water is, so that you've got a place, if where you are it's a bit infertile, a bit barren, where you know you can take your herds and your flocks and there will be water there. Digs a well so that he knows that there is a place where he will be able to take his herds and his flocks when he needs to. I was talking to a farmer today, and I was talking about sheep on hills. Being as I know nothing about these things, I was asking questions. And I was saying, well, do the farmers own the hills? And he was saying, no, generally they don't. They just have grazing rights on the hills, and you're allowed to graze so many sheep on the hill, and somebody else might be grazing their sheep on the hill as well, and they would be allowed so many sheep to graze there. And it has to be restricted, otherwise you would have too many sheep grazing on the hill and they'd all starve. The same applies to this picture here in Genesis about wells and nomads and their flocks and their herds. It was important to know which wells you could use, which were your wells, and ones which you couldn't use because they'd been dug by somebody else and it was their wells. And Abraham's men had dug this well in Beersheba. And then they discovered that Abimelech and his people were using the well. And Abraham quite reasonably goes to Abimelech and says, "What are you doing?" After all, Abraham has made this promise to Abimelech that he will not deal falsely with him, and here we seem to have exactly the opposite happening. Abimelech is dealing falsely with Abraham. It's a kind of one-way traffic that you are seeing here. And he goes to Abimelech, and Abimelech says immediately, he doesn't know anything about this. Yeah. Someone must have done this when I wasn't looking. It's not his responsibility. He kind of casts it off. Now, we don't know whether or not Abimelech within that statement is telling the truth, or he is just doing what many people do when they get caught, of saying, "I didn't know that happened. Someone must have done it when I wasn't looking." We don't know which it is. But Abimelech's response isn't one of simply saying, "Well, you're right. This is your well. I will stop my shepherds and my herdsmen from using it." He just says he didn't know anything about it. So Abraham goes away and he comes back with a gift for Abimelech. And the gift that he gives them is one by which they make a promise to each other, a covenant together. But oddly, the covenant isn't the one that you would expect. The covenant should be, Abraham's dug the well, it's his well. But that's not what's agreed upon. What's agreed upon is that both of them can use the well, which means really that Abraham's going to have to go away and dig another one somewhere else, because it probably won't be enough for both of them. And I read this and I thought, this doesn't strike me as being very fair. This isn't the kind of deal that you would necessarily make. Certainly, if you were insisting on your rights, this is not the deal that you would make. Abraham had every right to this well. His men had dug it. But he agrees that he will share it. And not only does he agree that he will share it, but that he gives a gift to Abimelech to do this. So not only does it appear that Abimelech has actually stolen his well, Abraham doesn't get it back, and not only doesn't Abraham not get it back, but he comes to a deal whereby he's going to share it and pays Abimelech for the privilege of sharing his own well. If you put it in those kind of terms, you suddenly realise that this doesn't strike you as being very fair or very just. It doesn't strike you that Abraham is someone who is standing there insisting on his own rights. There's a lesson within that. And the lesson within it is that it's better to live at peace than it is necessarily to insist on your own rights. It's better to find some way of compromise and living with peace with your neighbours than it is simply to insist on your own rights. You've probably come across these things occasionally in your own life, whether you've been involved with them personally or whether you know somebody who's been involved with these things personally. Neighbour disputes are one of the most difficult things ever to sort out. I don't know if you've discovered this yourself, but it is true. Neighbour disputes are very difficult things to sort out. People take this position that they are right and their neighbour is wrong, and their neighbour says that they are right and their neighbour is wrong, and there is no compromise, no way through, and they end up not talking to each other and erecting large fences and doing things deliberately to annoy each other. What Abraham does is to say that peace is better than insisting on your rights. And if we took that attitude a little bit more often, we'd probably find a great deal more peace within the world and within the communities that we live. Abraham doesn't insist on his rights. Abraham does that which allows both him and Abimelech to live at peace. What do we make then from this passage for our lives today? I think there are three basic lessons for us from this passage. One of them is that we should be the people who are seeking after peace. Peace should be more important to us than insisting on our rights. The second lesson is that we ought to be aware that just because we deal fairly and honourably and justly with other people does not necessarily mean that they are going to respond in the same way. And the third lesson is the one that I started with. I pray that we would all live our lives in such a relationship with Jesus that people would say of us that it's obvious that God is with us and is blessing us. Those I think are the lessons for us from this passage. Simple lessons, and if we take them, if we do deal fairly, justly and honourably with people, maybe they will see us differently and say, surely God is with them and blessing them. If we don't insist on our rights, but we work towards creating peace, maybe people will say, God is with them and is blessing them. I pray that the way that we live our lives would bring others to that conclusion, and that our lives would challenge people with the power of the gospel to transform people, to change lives, to make people different from the rest of the world, to make people be seen like disciples of Jesus, which is what we strive to be. Amen.